On March 15, 1891, 5 mill workers entered the Blackwood lumber mill for their night shift and never emerged. No bodies were found, no blood discovered, and within hours, every official record of their existence had been systematically erased. Some disappearances demand silence, others enforce it. The Blackwood lumber mill stood like a sleeping giant against the Michigan wilderness, its towering smokestacks piercing the star-scattered sky above Grand Rapids. Built in 1887 by industrialist Cornelius Blackwood, the mill operated around the clock, feeding America's insatiable hunger for timber with trees harvested from the seemingly endless forests of the Great Lakes region. But on the night of March 15, 1891, something went terribly wrong within those weathered wooden walls. The night shift had always been considered the most dangerous work at Blackwood Mill. 5 men were assigned to tend the massive steam-powered saws and sorting equipment while the rest of the city slept. The work required absolute precision. One moment of inattention could result in crushed limbs, severed fingers, or worse. Yet these 5 workers had earned their positions through years of experience and an almost supernatural ability to navigate the mill's hazards in near-total darkness. Thomas Kellerman, the night foreman, was a veteran of 15 years in the lumber industry. His weathered hands knew every lever, gear, and blade in the facility. At 34, he had survived accidents that would have killed lesser men, earning him the respect of both management and his fellow workers. His steady leadership had prevented countless injuries during the perilous night operations. Beside him worked the Schmidt brothers, Heinrich and Wilhelm, German immigrants who had fled economic hardship in the fatherland only to find themselves bound to the dangerous rhythms of industrial labor. Heinrich, 28, operated the primary steam saw with mechanical precision, while Wilhelm, 25, managed the sorting conveyors that carried freshly cut lumber toward the loading docks. Patrick O'Malley, barely 21, represented the newest generation of millworkers. The Irish immigrant had arrived in Grand Rapids just 6 months earlier, but his natural aptitude for machinery and fearless approach to dangerous work had quickly earned him a place on the coveted night crew. His youth and enthusiasm balanced the veteran experience of his older colleagues. The 5th man, Jonas Eriksson, was perhaps the most mysterious member of the group. The Norwegian immigrant rarely spoke about his past, but his skill with the mill's complex steam engines was legendary among the workers. Some whispered that he possessed an almost mystical understanding of mechanical systems, able to predict equipment failures days before they occurred. These 5 men had worked together for 8 months without incident, developing the seamless coordination necessary for night operations in the treacherous environment of the lumber mill. They trusted each other with their lives every shift, understanding that a single mistake by any team member could prove fatal for all. But on March 15, 1891, their expertise, caution, and teamwork would prove utterly inadequate against forces that defied all rational explanation. As the clock struck midnight, the 5 mill workers entered their workplace for the last time, walking unknowingly toward a fate that would be deemed too terrible to record. Mill supervisor Arthur Hensley had been keeping meticulous records for Blackwood Lumber since its opening 4 years earlier. His leather-bound ledgers documented every aspect of the operation: worker arrivals and departures, production numbers, equipment maintenance, and safety incidents. Hensley took pride in his precision, understanding that accurate documentation was essential for the mill's continued profitability and legal compliance with Michigan's emerging industrial safety regulations. On the evening of March 15th, Hensley personally witnessed all 5 night shift workers punch their time cards at exactly 11:47 p.m. The mechanical time clock, imported from Massachusetts and considered the most reliable model available, stamped each card with the distinctive mark that would serve as proof of their presence. Thomas Kellerman signed in first, followed by the Schmidt brothers, then O'Malley, and finally the taciturn Eriksson. "Weather's turning," Kellerman mentioned to Hensley as he adjusted his work gloves. The March evening had grown unusually cold, and a thick fog was rolling in from the Grand River, reducing visibility around the mill grounds to mere yards. "Might be a quiet night if this keeps up." Hensley nodded, making a notation about the weather conditions in his daily log. Such details often proved important when investigating equipment malfunctions or accidents, as temperature and humidity could affect the performance of the steam-powered machinery. He watched the 5 men disappear into the mill's interior, their oil lanterns casting dancing shadows on the walls as they began their familiar routines. The night supervisor's responsibilities required him to remain on the premises until 6 a.m., when the day shift would arrive to relieve the night crew. Hensley maintained an office in a small building adjacent to the main mill structure, positioned to allow him oversight of both the production floor and the loading docks where finished lumber waited for transport to customers throughout the Midwest. At 3:15 a.m., Hensley made his routine inspection of the mill floor as required by company policy. The machinery hummed with its usual mechanical rhythm, steam hissed from the boilers, and the sweet scent of fresh-cut pine filled the air. Everything appeared normal, yet something felt subtly wrong. The mill seemed too quiet, lacking the occasional shouts and conversations that usually accompanied night operations. Hensley called out to Kellerman but received no response. Assuming the foreman was occupied with equipment in the mill's far section, the supervisor completed his inspection and returned to his office to continue reviewing production reports and correspondence from Blackwood's corporate headquarters in Detroit. It would be another 2 hours before Arthur Hensley realized that something had gone catastrophically wrong in the depths of the Blackwood lumber mill. By then, the 5 night shift workers had been missing for over 4 hours, and the chain of events that would erase their very existence from official records had already begun. Dawn broke gray and cold over Grand Rapids on March 16, 1891, as the day shift workers trudged through the mill gates for another 12 hours of dangerous labor. The fog that had rolled in the previous evening still clung to the Grand River like a burial shroud, muffling sound and creating an atmosphere of unnatural quiet around the Blackwood facility. Day foreman Marcus Brennan arrived at 5:45 a.m., 15 minutes early, as was his habit, to review the night's production reports and prepare for the shift transition. Brennan was a methodical man who had worked his way up from the mill floor through 15 years of dedicated service, and he took personal pride in maintaining smooth operations despite the inherent chaos of industrial lumber production. Walking toward Hensley's office, Brennan immediately noticed that the night supervisor appeared agitated, pacing behind his desk with unusual energy. Through the window, the mill floor appeared strangely still. The massive steam saws silent, the conveyor belts motionless, and the boilers reduced to barely glowing embers. "Arthur," Brennan called as he entered the office. "What's the situation? Equipment problems?" Hensley looked up with haggard eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. "I can't find them, Marcus. The night crew. They're nowhere in the building. I've searched every section twice, called out until my voice gave out, but there's no sign of any of them." The day foreman felt ice water flow through his veins. 5 experienced workers didn't simply vanish from a locked facility. "When did you last see them?" "They punched in at 11:47 last night," Hensley replied, gesturing toward the time cards that lay scattered across his desk. "I made my 3:15 inspection, thought everything was normal, but now, Marcus, it's as if they were never here at all." Together, the 2 supervisors conducted a systematic search of the entire mill complex. The machinery showed no signs of accident or struggle, no bloodstains, no damaged equipment, no torn clothing caught in gears or conveyor belts. The workers' personal belongings remained in their lockers, including lunch pails still packed with food their wives had prepared the previous evening. Most disturbing of all was the state of the production area itself. Despite running for nearly 4 hours, the night shift had produced no finished lumber. Logs that had been positioned for cutting remained untouched, and the sorting areas contained no evidence of any work having been performed. It was as if the 5 men had entered the mill and simply ceased to exist. As more day shift workers arrived and learned of the situation, a crowd gathered outside Hensley's office. Whispered conversations filled with speculation and growing fear rippled through the group. 5 of their colleagues had vanished without explanation, leaving behind only questions that no one seemed capable of answering. But the mystery was only beginning, and the forces responsible for the disappearance were already working to ensure that the truth would never come to light. Sheriff Edmund Hayes had served Kent County for 12 years, dealing with the usual array of crimes that plagued a growing industrial city. Theft, drunkenness, domestic disputes, and occasional violence between rival ethnic groups competing for mill jobs. But when Arthur Hensley appeared at his office on March 16th with reports of 5 missing workers, Hayes knew he was facing something entirely outside his experience. The sheriff was a methodical investigator who had learned to approach unusual cases with systematic thoroughness. Accompanied by Deputy William Morse, Hayes arrived at the Blackwood Mill at 10 a.m. to begin what he assumed would be a routine missing persons investigation. His initial theory suggested the workers had been victims of an industrial accident that had somehow obscured the evidence, or perhaps they had fled town together for reasons yet to be determined. Hayes began his investigation by interviewing the day-shift workers who had discovered the situation. Their accounts were consistent and deeply troubling. The mill's machinery showed no signs of operation despite having run for hours during the night shift. Steam pressure gauges indicated the boilers had been properly maintained, yet no production had occurred. Most puzzling of all, the massive steam saws had been left in perfect operating condition, as if the workers had simply walked away in the middle of their duties. The sheriff's examination of the physical evidence yielded even more disturbing details. The workers' time cards showed clear punch-in marks at 11:47 p.m., but there were no corresponding punch-out cards to indicate when they might have left the facility. The mill's single entrance remained locked from the inside, with no signs of forced entry or struggle around the heavy wooden doors. Hayes ordered a thorough search of the mill's basement and upper levels, areas rarely visited except for maintenance purposes. Deputy Morse discovered that several pieces of specialized equipment appeared to have been recently moved or adjusted. Though no one could explain why the night crew would have needed to access these systems. Strange marks in the dust on the basement floor suggested heavy objects had been dragged across the concrete, but the trails led nowhere and seemed to serve no logical purpose. More troubling still was the sheriff's discovery that the mill's large loading dock doors, typically secured with heavy chains and padlocks, showed fresh scratches around the locking mechanisms. The scratches appeared recent, made by someone attempting to open or close the doors with considerable urgency. Yet nothing was missing from the lumber inventory, and no unauthorized vehicles had been reported in the area during the night. As Hayes continued his investigation throughout the day, interviewing neighbors and examining the surrounding grounds, he began to suspect that the disappearance of the 5 mill workers was not an isolated incident, but rather part of something far more sinister than anyone in Grand Rapids was prepared to acknowledge. The truth would prove even more disturbing than his worst fears. At precisely 2 p.m. on March the 16th, a gleaming black carriage bearing the Blackwood corporate seal arrived at the mill gates, carrying passengers whose presence would fundamentally alter the course of the investigation. Cornelius Blackwood himself had made the journey from Detroit, accompanied by his corporate attorney, Reginald Ashworth, and a man introduced only as Mr. Harrison, whose specific role remained mysteriously undefined. Blackwood was an imposing figure who had built his lumber empire through a combination of ruthless business acumen and an intuitive understanding of Michigan's political machinery. At 52, he possessed the bearing of a man accustomed to bending circumstances to his will, and his sudden appearance at the mill suggested that the missing workers represented more than a simple personnel problem. Sheriff Hayes found himself immediately relegated to a secondary role as Blackwood's entourage took control of the situation. Attorney Ashworth Prees had ignited legal documents establishing corporate authority over the investigation, citing complex industrial safety regulations that placed primary responsibility for workplace incidents in the hands of company officials rather than local law enforcement. "Sheriff, I appreciate your diligence," Blackwood said in a voice that carried the authority of wealth and political connections. "But this matter involves proprietary industrial processes and competitive trade secrets that must be protected. My company will conduct its own internal investigation using specialists trained in lumber mill operations." The mysterious Mr. Harrison began photographing the mill interior with expensive equipment that suggested professional expertise in criminal investigation. His methodical documentation of every detail seemed to serve a purpose beyond simple evidence collection, almost as if he were creating a comprehensive record that could later be used to support whatever narrative Blackwood chose to establish. Deputy Morse whispered to Sheriff Hayes that he had recognized Harrison from newspaper photographs. The man was reportedly a private investigator who specialized in handling sensitive situations for wealthy industrialists throughout the Great Lakes region. His reputation suggested that problems had a tendency to disappear entirely when Harrison became involved in their resolution. As afternoon wore into evening, Hayes watched helplessly as Blackwood's team systematically took possession of all physical evidence related to the disappearance. The time cards, production records, and even the workers' personal belongings were loaded into corporate vehicles under the supervision of armed security guards who had arrived with the Detroit contingent. "The families will want answers," Hayes protested as he watched evidence disappearing into Blackwood's control. 5 men don't just vanish without explanation. Blackwood's smile was cold and calculating. "Sheriff, I'm afraid you'll find that these men were never employed by my company. Our records show no evidence of their existence, and I'm confident that any confusion about their supposed presence here will be resolved once proper documentation is reviewed." The corporate cover-up was beginning, and Hayes realized that forces far beyond his authority were already working to ensure that the truth about March 15th would never be revealed. As news of the disappearances spread through Grand Rapids' tight-knit immigrant communities, the families of the missing workers gathered at the modest home of Thomas Kellerman's widow, Margaret, seeking answers that no official authority seemed willing or able to provide. The cramped parlor filled with voices speaking English, German, Irish, and Norwegian, as desperate relatives struggled to understand how 5 men could simply vanish from existence. Margaret Kellerman, 31 years old and suddenly left to care for 3 young children, had spent the day demanding information from mill officials, only to be told that no record existed of her husband's employment at Blackwood Lumber. The woman who had packed Thomas's lunch pail every day for 8 months was being informed that her marriage to a mill worker was apparently a fantasy she had somehow constructed in her grief-stricken mind. Anna Schmidt faced an even more devastating situation. Both her husband Heinrich and his brother Wilhelm had disappeared, leaving her and her sister-in-law Greta to care for 5 children between them. The Schmidt brothers had sent regular money to relatives in Germany, and their sudden absence threatened not only their immediate families but also elderly parents across the Atlantic who depended on their financial support for survival. Bridget O'Malley, barely 19 and married to Patrick for less than a year, clutched a letter her husband had written to his family in County Cork, describing his pride at being selected for the mill's night shift. The letter, dated just 2 weeks earlier, provided tangible proof of Patrick's employment that directly contradicted corporate claims about his non-existence. Yet when she presented this evidence to mill supervisors, she was told that the letter must be a forgery created by someone seeking to defraud the company. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the situation of Astrid Eriksson, Jonas's wife, who spoke little English and struggled to understand why authorities refused to acknowledge her husband's disappearance. Jonas had been the primary breadwinner for not only his immediate family but also for 3 Norwegian relatives who shared their small rented house. Without his income, the entire extended family faced destitution and possible deportation. The women's attempts to seek help from local authorities proved futile. Sheriff Hayes, clearly frustrated by restrictions placed on his investigation, could offer only sympathetic words and promises to continue seeking answers through unofficial channels. The city government, influenced by Blackwood's considerable political contributions, showed little interest in pursuing a case that threatened to damage relations with one of Grand Rapids' largest employers. As evening fell on March the 16th, the families found themselves facing not only the devastating loss of their loved ones, but also a systematic campaign to deny that those loved ones had ever existed. Corporate power was being used to rewrite reality itself, transforming 5 living, breathing human beings into phantom workers who had never walked the earth. But the women refused to accept this erasure of their husbands' and brothers' lives, setting the stage for a desperate fight against forces that seemed determined to bury the truth forever. Throughout the night of March 16th, while the families of the missing workers struggled with their devastating loss, a team of corporate specialists worked methodically to erase every trace of the 5 men's connection to Blackwood Lumber. The operation, supervised by the enigmatic Mr. Harrison, proceeded with the precision of a military campaign designed to eliminate an enemy from existence. Mill supervisor Arthur Hensley arrived at his office on March 17th to find that his meticulously maintained records had been reorganized during the night. The leather-bound ledgers that had documented every aspect of mill operations for 4 years now showed subtle but significant alterations. Names had been changed, employment dates adjusted, and entire entries removed with such skill that even Hensley began to question his own memory of recent events. The time cards that had provided concrete evidence of the workers' presence on March 15th had been replaced with different cards showing alternative personnel assignments. According to the new documentation, the night shift on March 15th had been handled by workers who were very much alive and available for questioning. When Hensley protested these alterations, he was informed that his employment contract contained strict confidentiality clauses that prohibited him from discussing internal company operations with outside parties. More disturbing still was the discovery that payroll records had been retroactively modified to show that Thomas Kellerman, the Schmidt brothers, Patrick O'Malley, and Jonas Eriksson had never been employed by Blackwood Lumber Mill. Their names had been systematically removed from employment rosters, insurance records, and safety training documentation. Even the photographs taken for company identification badges had disappeared from corporate files. The boarding houses and rental properties where the missing workers had lived were visited by well-dressed men who offered landlords substantial sums of money in exchange for revised rental records. Suddenly, the rooms that had housed the 5 workers were retroactively shown to have been occupied by different tenants or to have remained vacant during the period's inns. Question: local merchants who had extended credit to the missing workers received unexpected visits from corporate representatives bearing offers to settle outstanding debts in exchange for modified account records. The neighborhood grocery store where Margaret Kellerman had shopped using her husband's mill wages was persuaded to alter its credit ledgers, erasing months of transactions that proved Thomas's employment and income. Even more sinister was the systematic intimidation of potential witnesses. Day shift workers who had known and worked alongside the missing men were offered promotions and salary increases in exchange for signing sworn affidavits stating that they had never encountered the 5 individuals in question. Those who refused to cooperate found their own employment terminated for vague performance issues that had never previously been documented. The corporate machine was rewriting history itself, using a combination of financial incentives, legal pressure, and outright intimidation to transform 5 flesh-and-blood human beings into phantoms that had never existed. But erasure of the official record was only the first phase of Blackwood's comprehensive cover-up strategy. By March 18th, the systematic intimidation campaign had extended beyond mill employees to encompass every person in Grand Rapids who might possess knowledge of the 5 missing workers. The corporate operation, orchestrated with chilling efficiency, demonstrated that Blackwood Lumber possessed resources and connections far beyond what a regional timber company should logically command. Dr. Heinrich Müller, the German physician who had treated Wilhelm Schmidt for a work-related injury just 2 weeks earlier, received an unexpected visit from corporate attorney Reginald Ashworth. The lawyer presented medical malpractice allegations that threatened to destroy Müller's practice unless he agreed to revise his patient records to remove all references to his treatment of mill workers. Faced with professional ruin, the doctor reluctantly complied, burning his original case notes in his office fireplace while Ashworth observed. Father Michael O'Brien, the Irish Catholic priest who had performed the marriage ceremony for Patrick and Bridget O'Malley, found his church facing sudden financial difficulties when major donors withdrew their support following concerns about the accuracy of parish records. The message was unmistakable: cooperate with the corporate narrative or watch his congregation suffer. O'Brien spent a tormented night in prayer before agreeing to modify the marriage certificate, changing the groom's listed occupation from mill worker to general laborer. The Norwegian Lutheran minister who had counseled Jonas Eriksson through his struggles with English learned that his small congregation's meeting hall lease would not be renewed unless he demonstrated better judgment in maintaining accurate records. Pastor Olson watched helplessly as pages were torn from his ministerial journal, erasing documentation of Eriksson's spiritual struggles and his pride in securing steady employment at the mill. Even more disturbing was the treatment of Anna Mitchell, the elderly woman who operated a boarding house where Thomas Kellerman had lived before his marriage. Mitchell initially refused corporate offers to modify her rental records, insisting that she would never deny the existence of a man she had come to regard as a son. 2 nights later, her boarding house suffered a mysterious fire that destroyed only the room Kellerman had occupied, along with all personal belongings he had stored there. The fire department's investigation concluded that the blaze was caused by defective wiring, but Mitchell understood the true message. Sheriff Hayes watched these developments with growing anger and frustration, recognizing a coordinated campaign to obstruct his investigation through methods that skirted the edges of legality. His attempts to interview potential witnesses were consistently thwarted by sudden memory lapses, relocated families, and revised stories that eliminated any reference to the missing workers. The sheriff realized that he was fighting an enemy with unlimited resources and no apparent moral constraints. Corporate power was being weaponized to rewrite reality itself, and the traditional institutions of law and justice seemed powerless to resist the assault on truth. But Hayes refused to abandon his investigation, even as the evidence disappeared and the witnesses fell silent. Somewhere in the shadows of this cover-up, 5 men had met a fate terrible enough to justify this extraordinary campaign of erasure. As the official investigation stalled and witnesses fell silent under corporate pressure, an informal network of resistance began to emerge among those who refused to accept the systematic erasure of 5 human lives. Led by Sheriff Hayes and the desperate families of the missing workers, this underground movement operated in secret, sharing information and evidence that corporate agents had not yet succeeded in destroying. Margaret Kellerman emerged as an unexpected leader in this clandestine effort. Her determination to prove her husband's existence drove her to collect every scrap of evidence that might contradict the corporate narrative. She retrieved letters Thomas had written to his brother in Ohio, contacted former employers who could testify to his work history before joining Blackwood, and assembled a collection of personal photographs that documented his life and relationships within the Grand Rapids community. Working with Margaret was Bridget O'Malley, whose youth and apparent innocence allowed her to approach potential witnesses without arousing the suspicion of corporate surveillance teams. Bridget discovered that several mill workers were willing to provide information in secret, even though they had publicly denied knowledge of the missing men. These whispered conversations, conducted in Irish pubs and German social clubs, revealed disturbing details about unusual activities at the mill in the weeks preceding the disappearance. Anna and Greta Schmidt proved particularly valuable to the resistance effort due to their connections within Grand Rapids' German immigrant community. German-language newspapers had begun reporting on the disappearances, despite pressure from corporate advertisers to suppress the stories. The sisters helped translate these reports and distribute them throughout ethnic neighborhoods where English-language media held less influence. Sheriff Hayes contributed his professional expertise to the underground investigation, using his authority to access records and interview subjects that were beyond the reach of civilian activists. However, Hayes was forced to operate with extreme caution, as his superiors had made clear that his continued employment depended on avoiding actions that might embarrass or antagonize Blackwood Lumber. The Resistance Network's most valuable asset proved to be Professor Charles Whitmore, a history instructor at Grand Rapids Business College who had become intrigued by the case from an academic perspective. Whitmore possessed research skills and access to historical archives that allowed him to trace patterns of similar incidents throughout Michigan's lumber industry, revealing that the Blackwood disappearance was not an isolated event. Through painstaking research, Professor Whitmore had uncovered newspaper accounts of unexplained worker disappearances at lumber mills throughout the Great Lakes region, dating back to the 1870s. In each case, the incidents had been followed by systematic campaigns to erase evidence and silence witnesses. The pattern suggested a coordinated effort involving multiple corporations and possibly government officials at the state level. As March gave way to April, the underground resistance had assembled a substantial collection of evidence that contradicted the official narrative. But their investigation was also revealing that they faced an enemy far more powerful and ruthless than anyone had initially imagined. The truth about the 5 missing workers was emerging, and it was more terrifying than anyone had dared to fear. Professor Whitmore's research into the Blackwood lumber mill's brief history revealed disturbing patterns that suggested the March 15th disappearance was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of a series of increasingly severe accidents that had plagued the facility since its opening in 1887. His investigation, conducted in secret archives and newspaper morgues throughout Michigan, painted a picture of an operation that seemed to consume workers with alarming regularity. The mill's construction had itself been marked by tragedy. 3 workers had died during the building process, officially attributed to falls from scaffolding and equipment malfunctions. However, contemporary newspaper accounts suggested that all 3 deaths had occurred under mysterious circumstances, with witnesses reporting strange sounds and unexplained phenomena at the construction site. The workers' bodies had been quickly removed and buried in unmarked graves, with their families receiving unusually generous compensation packages in exchange for silence. Once operational, the mill had experienced an abnormally high rate of worker injuries and deaths compared to similar facilities throughout the region. Between 1887 and 1891, 17 workers had been killed in various accidents, and dozens more had suffered severe injuries that left them permanently disabled. Most troubling was the pattern of these incidents. They occurred almost exclusively during night shifts, and the victims were typically experienced workers rather than inexperienced newcomers who might be expected to make fatal mistakes. Professor Whitmore discovered that several families had claimed victims beyond the 5 recently disappeared workers, representing a pattern of violence that extended back to the mill's earliest operations. Most chilling of all was Sheriff Hayes' discovery of a ledger hidden beneath a false floor in the largest chamber. Written in a code that combined English, German, and what appeared to be chemical formulas, the ledger documented dates, names, and procedures spanning nearly 4 years. While much of the text remained indecipherable, certain entries clearly corresponded to dates when workers had officially died in accidents or left town seeking better opportunities. Dr. Richardson's analysis of the chemical residues revealed the use of industrial acids capable of completely dissolving human remains within hours, leaving no trace that forensic science of the 1890s could detect. The drainage system had been specifically engineered to carry dissolved organic matter into the Grand River, where it would be dispersed and diluted beyond any possibility of detection. The 3 investigators realized they had uncovered evidence of a systematic murder operation disguised as an industrial facility. The Blackwood lumber mill was indeed cutting something other than timber. It was systematically eliminating human beings who had somehow become inconvenient to corporate interests. But who was ordering these murders, and how many victims had already disappeared into the mill's chemical dissolution chambers? As Sheriff Hayes and his allies delved deeper into the evidence from the mill's basement chambers, a horrifying picture began to emerge of a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond Grand Rapids and involved corruption at the highest levels of Michigan's political and business establishment. The coded ledger found in the dissolution chambers contained references that suggested systematic murder operations at industrial sites throughout the Great Lakes region. Professor Whitmore's analysis of the coded entries revealed a network of lumber mills, steel foundries, and mining operations that appeared to share resources and information about problematic employees who required permanent resolution. The dates and locations mentioned in the ledger corresponded to unexplained disappearances of labor organizers, safety inspectors, and workers who had threatened to expose dangerous or illegal practices at their workplaces. Cross-referencing newspaper archives from Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, and other industrial centers revealed a disturbing pattern of missing persons cases involving individuals who had challenged corporate authority or possessed knowledge of industrial accidents and safety violations. In each case, the disappearances had been followed by systematic campaigns to erase evidence and intimidate potential witnesses, the same pattern now being employed in Grand Rapids. The Resistance Network's investigation revealed that Cornelius Blackwood served as more than just a lumber baron. He appeared to function as a regional coordinator for what amounted to an industrial assassination service. Companies throughout the region could apparently arrange for the elimination of troublesome employees through a network of specially constructed facilities designed to dispose of human remains without leaving forensic evidence. Dr. Richardson's chemical analysis had identified the specific acids and dissolution agents used in the basement chambers, and his research revealed that these materials were being purchased and distributed through a supply network that served multiple industrial sites across Michigan, Wisconsin, and northern Illinois. The quantities involved suggested operations far more extensive than the elimination of a few problematic workers at individual mills. Most disturbing of all, was the discovery that government officials at the state and local levels were actively participating in these cover-up operations. The speed and efficiency with which records were being altered, witnesses intimidated, and investigations suppressed required cooperation from law enforcement, judicial, and regulatory authorities throughout the region. Sheriff Hayes realized that his own position was becoming increasingly precarious as his investigation threatened to expose corruption within his own department. Several of his fellow law enforcement officers had clearly been compromised, receiving payments or political favors in exchange for their cooperation with corporate interests. The underground resistance faced a terrible choice. They could attempt to expose a criminal conspiracy that involved some of the most powerful figures in the region, knowing that such exposure would likely result in their own disappearance into the dissolution chambers, or they could abandon their investigation and allow the systematic murder of workers to continue unchallenged. The stakes had escalated beyond justice for 5 missing workers to a fight for the survival of anyone who dared to challenge industrial power in the new American economy. In early April 1891, the Resistance Network received an unexpected breakthrough when Margaret Kellerman was contacted by a man who claimed to have survived an attempt on his life at the Blackwood Mill. Lars Anderson, a former night shift worker who had officially left town 6 months earlier, had been hiding in the Minnesota wilderness since escaping what he now revealed had been a murder attempt in the mill's basement chambers. Anderson's account, provided in a secret meeting arranged through Norwegian immigrant networks, revealed the terrifying final moments of workers who had discovered too much about the mill's true purpose. He had been working the night shift in October 1890 when he accidentally discovered the concealed entrance to the basement chambers while investigating a steam leak in the boiler room. "They had a man down there," Anderson whispered, his voice trembling with remembered horror. "Chained to the wall, still alive but barely conscious. The smell. God help me, the smell was like nothing you could imagine. There were vats of chemicals and implements that belonged in no lumber mill." Anderson described witnessing mill supervisor Arthur Hensley and the mysterious Mr. Harrison supervising the dissolution of what remained of a previous victim. The process, conducted with mechanical efficiency, involved the systematic application of industrial acids that reduced human remains to a slurry that could be safely disposed of through the mill's drainage system. When Anderson attempted to flee, he was captured by security guards who had been positioned throughout the mill specifically to prevent such discoveries. He was taken to the basement chambers where Harrison explained that the mill served a dual purpose. Legitimate lumber production provided cover for a regional elimination service that disposed of problematic individuals for corporate clients throughout the Midwest. "They told me I was lucky to be Norwegian," Anderson continued. "They said my disappearance wouldn't attract much attention, and they were going to make it look like I had returned to the old country. But when they were preparing the chemicals, I managed to break free from the restraints and escape through a drainage tunnel that led to the river." Anderson had spent the winter in hiding, afraid to contact authorities because Harrison had told him that the operation enjoyed protection at the highest levels of Michigan government. His decision to finally come forward was motivated by newspaper accounts of the 5 missing workers, whose fate he recognized as identical to what had been planned for him. Most chilling of all was Anderson's revelation that the 5 workers who had disappeared on March 15th had been specifically targeted because they had begun asking questions about suspicious activities during their night shifts. Thomas Kellerman had apparently discovered evidence of the basement operations and had been planning to contact authorities, making him and his colleagues immediate threats to the entire criminal enterprise. The survivors' testimony provided the Resistance Network with crucial evidence, but it also confirmed their worst fears about the scope and brutality of the conspiracy they were attempting to expose. Lars Anderson's testimony revealed that the murder operation at Blackwood Mill enjoyed protection from corruption that reached the highest levels of Michigan's political establishment. His detailed account of conversations overheard during his captivity exposed a network of complicity that involved state legislators, judicial officials, and law enforcement leaders who had been systematically compromised through bribery, blackmail, and shared participation in criminal activities. According to Anderson, the basement chambers were frequently visited by well-dressed men who arrived in expensive carriages bearing the insignia of various government agencies. These officials would observe the dissolution process with the detached interest of investors examining a profitable business operation, discussing the efficiency improvements and capacity expansion that would allow the facility to handle larger volumes of problematic cases. Most shocking was Anderson's identification of State Senator Jamison Crawford, a prominent Republican who chaired the committee overseeing industrial safety regulations, as a regular visitor to the mill's criminal operations. Crawford had apparently invested heavily in the elimination service, viewing it as a solution to the growing problems posed by labor organizers and safety inspectors who threatened to interfere with industrial profits. The survivor also described meetings between Harrison and representatives from lumber mills, steel foundries, and mining operations throughout the Great Lakes region. These sessions involved the coordination of elimination schedules, the sharing of dissolution technology, and the distribution of assignments based on geographic convenience and local political conditions. Professor Whitmore's research corroborated Anderson's revelations by uncovering financial records that showed suspicious payments flowing between various industrial enterprises and political figures throughout Michigan. Campaign contributions, consulting fees, and real estate transactions created a paper trail that suggested systematic corruption on a scale previously unimaginable in American politics. Sheriff Hayes realized that his investigation had uncovered not just a local murder operation, but evidence of what amounted to state-sponsored terrorism against working-class Americans who dared to challenge industrial authority. The systematic elimination of labor organizers, safety inspectors, and whistleblowing workers represented a coordinated assault on the democratic rights that supposedly protected American citizens from corporate tyranny. The political implications were staggering. If the evidence gathered by the resistance network was accurate, then significant portions of Michigan's government had been transformed into instruments of corporate violence, with elected officials serving as accomplices in the systematic murder of their own constituents. But exposing this corruption would require evidence that could withstand legal challenges from the most powerful attorneys in the region, and witnesses willing to testify despite facing almost certain death for their cooperation. The resistance network possessed compelling evidence of criminal activity, but translating that evidence into successful prosecutions would require resources and protection that seemed impossible to obtain. The fight for justice for 5 missing workers had evolved into a battle for the soul of American democracy itself, with the outcome likely to determine whether corporate power could literally murder its way to complete control over the nation's workers. In late April 1891, Professor Whitmore made a decision that would either save or destroy the resistance network's efforts to expose the Blackwood conspiracy. Using his academic connections, he contacted federal authorities in Washington, D.C., hoping to find investigators who operated beyond the reach of Michigan's corrupted political machine. His carefully worded letter to the Treasury Department's Secret Service Division described patterns of interstate criminal activity that might justify federal intervention. The response exceeded Whitmore's most optimistic expectations. Special Agent Theodore Morrison arrived in Grand Rapids on May 2nd, carrying credentials from the Treasury Department and instructions to investigate reports of interstate conspiracy, tax evasion, and postal fraud related to the systematic elimination of federal witnesses and informants. Morrison's arrival represented the first hope the resistance network had encountered for prosecution efforts that could not be compromised by local political corruption. Morrison proved to be a methodical investigator whose experience with complex financial crimes provided exactly the expertise needed to unravel the corporate conspiracy. His initial meetings with Sheriff Hayes and the resistance network members revealed that federal authorities had been tracking suspicious patterns of missing persons cases throughout the industrial Midwest for several years, but had lacked sufficient evidence to justify major investigations. The evidence compiled by the Grand Rapids Resistance Network provided the federal breakthrough Morrison's superiors had been seeking. The coded ledger from the mill's basement chambers contained references to interstate transportation of victims, coordination between facilities in multiple states, and financial transactions that violated federal banking regulations. These violations gave Morrison the jurisdiction needed to launch a comprehensive federal investigation. More importantly, Morrison brought resources that local investigators could never hope to match. His team included forensic specialists, undercover agents, and prosecutors who had experience with complex conspiracy cases involving multiple defendants across state lines. Federal protection could be provided for witnesses willing to testify, and federal courts could hear evidence without interference from locally corrupted judges and juries. Morrison's investigation began with a covert examination of the Blackwood Mill's basement chambers, using federal warrants that Cornelius Blackwood's political connections could not suppress or delay. Federal agents recovered additional evidence from the dissolution chambers, including chemical residues that contained traces of human DNA, a new forensic technique that provided conclusive proof of multiple murders. Perhaps most significantly, Morrison's team arrested Arthur Hensley during a midnight raid, offering him federal protection in exchange for complete cooperation with the investigation. Hensley's detailed confession provided federal prosecutors with an insider's account of the criminal operation structure, financing, and political connections. The federal investigation represented a turning point in the fight for justice, but it also escalated the danger faced by resistance network members. Corporate interests had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their secrets, and federal intervention threatened to expose corruption that powerful figures would kill to keep hidden. The battle for truth was entering its most dangerous phase. Under federal protection in a secure facility outside Grand Rapids, Arthur Hensley provided investigators with a comprehensive account of the Blackwood Mill's criminal operations that exceeded even the resistance network's most disturbing theories. His confession, recorded over 3 days of intensive questioning, revealed a murder enterprise of unprecedented scope and sophistication that had been operating throughout the industrial Midwest for nearly 2 decades. Hensley admitted that his role as mill supervisor had been largely fictional. His primary responsibilities involved coordinating the elimination schedules, supervising the dissolution process, and maintaining the records that tracked victims and disposal methods. The legitimate lumber production served merely as cover for what amounted to a regional assassination service that disposed of problematic individuals for corporate clients throughout multiple states. According to Hensley's testimony, the 5 workers who disappeared on March 15th had been specifically targeted because Thomas Kellerman had discovered financial irregularities in the mill's operational records. Kellerman's investigation had revealed that certain night shift production statistics bore no relationship to actual lumber output, suggesting that the mill was being used for purposes unrelated to its ostensible business operations. The elimination itself had been conducted with mechanical efficiency that reflected years of experience. The 5 workers had been lured to the basement chambers under the pretext of investigating equipment problems, then subdued using chemicals that left no defensive wounds or signs of struggle. The dissolution process had been completed within 6 hours, with the remains disposed of through the drainage system that carried dissolved organic matter directly into the Grand River. Hensley's confession provided federal investigators with detailed information about the broader criminal network, including the names of corporate clients, the locations of similar facilities throughout the region, and the financial arrangements that funded the murder operations. He estimated that the Blackwood facility alone had eliminated over 60 individuals since beginning operations in 1887, with victim totals reaching into the hundreds when similar mills throughout the Midwest were included in the count. Perhaps most damaging was Hensley's testimony about political corruption, which identified specific legislators, judges, and law enforcement officials who had received payments in exchange for their cooperation with the criminal enterprise. His records documented bribes totaling over $200,000, an enormous sum by 1891 standards that had been distributed to ensure official protection for the murder operations. Hensley also revealed the existence of detailed photographic documentation that had been maintained for blackmail purposes, showing prominent political figures observing elimination procedures and participating in disposal activities. These photographs, hidden in safety deposit boxes throughout Michigan, provided federal prosecutors with evidence of criminal complicity that would be impossible for corrupt officials to deny or explain away. The confession represented a complete exposure of the conspiracy, but it also confirmed that the resistance network had been fighting an enemy whose power and ruthlessness exceeded their most paranoid suspicions. Justice for the 5 missing workers now seemed possible, but at a cost that would reshape the political landscape of the entire region. News of Hensley's confession and the expanding federal investigation prompted a desperate and vicious response from the corporate interests whose criminal activities faced imminent exposure. Within hours of learning about federal involvement, Cornelius Blackwood and his associates launched a coordinated campaign of intimidation and violence designed to eliminate key witnesses and destroy all remaining evidence before prosecutors could build their case. The retaliation began with systematic attacks on resistance network members who had provided crucial evidence to federal investigators. Margaret Kellerman's home was destroyed by fire during the night of May the 10th, though she and her children escaped unharmed thanks to a warning from Sheriff Hayes, who had learned of the planned attack through his remaining contacts within local law enforcement. The message was unmistakable. Cooperation with federal authorities carried deadly consequences. Bridget O'Malley faced even more direct threats when masked men attempted to abduct her from her workplace at a local textile factory. Only the intervention of fellow Irish workers who fought off the attackers with improvised weapons prevented her disappearance into the same dissolution chambers that had claimed her husband. The incident demonstrated that corporate agents were prepared to commit murder in broad daylight to protect their secrets. Professor Whitmore discovered that his academic position provided no protection from corporate vengeance when university administrators informed him that his employment would be terminated unless he ceased his inappropriate political activities. The pressure came directly from wealthy donors who had contributed heavily to the university's endowment fund, illustrating the extent to which corporate money had compromised even educational institutions that should have remained independent. Most disturbing was the systematic elimination of potential witnesses who had not yet been contacted by federal investigators. Lars Anderson, the survivor whose testimony had provided crucial evidence about the mill's operations, was found dead in his Minnesota hideout under circumstances that suggested professional assassination. His death served as a warning to other potential witnesses that federal protection could not guarantee their safety. The corporate retaliation extended beyond individual targets to include coordinated political pressure designed to terminate the federal investigation before it could reach court. State legislators who had been compromised by the conspiracy introduced bills that would restrict federal jurisdiction over local industrial matters, while corrupted judges issued rulings that challenged the validity of federal warrants and evidence collection procedures. Media outlets throughout Michigan suddenly began publishing editorials that questioned the credibility of federal investigators and suggested that the entire investigation represented federal overreach into legitimate state business concerns. These coordinated propaganda efforts, funded by corporate advertising money, created public confusion about the facts of the case and generated political pressure to abandon the prosecution efforts. Federal Agent Morrison recognized that his investigation faced an enemy willing to commit additional murders to protect their existing crimes, and that success would require rapid progress before corporate retaliation could eliminate all witnesses and evidence. The race against time had begun, with justice competing against murder for the final outcome. As corporate retaliation intensified, Sheriff Hayes and Federal Agent Morrison developed an elaborate witness protection system that operated like an underground railroad, moving endangered individuals through a network of safe houses and trusted contacts before they could be eliminated by corporate assassins. The operation required careful coordination between federal resources and local allies who remained loyal to justice despite overwhelming pressure to abandon the investigation. Margaret Kellerman and her children were relocated to a farm owned by Norwegian immigrants near the Minnesota border, where the extended Erickson family network provided both protection and anonymity. The location offered multiple escape routes through wilderness areas that would be difficult for corporate agents to monitor, while the Norwegian community's tight-knit structure ensured that strangers would be quickly identified and reported. Bridget O'Malley was moved to a Catholic convent in Wisconsin, where the sisters provided sanctuary that appealed to both her religious faith and her need for security. The nuns' commitment to protecting vulnerable women created an environment where corporate intimidation tactics would be less effective, while the convent's isolation made surveillance and assault attempts more difficult to execute successfully. The Schmidt sisters and their children faced the most complex relocation because their large family size made concealment difficult. Morrison arranged for their transportation to German immigrant communities in Nebraska, where their linguistic and cultural connections would allow them to blend into established populations while maintaining contact with federal investigators through coded correspondence. Professor Whitmore proved most resistant to relocation, insisting that his academic responsibilities required him to remain in Grand Rapids despite the obvious threats to his safety. Morrison compromised by providing round-the-clock federal protection, while Whitmore completed his documentation of the historical evidence that would be crucial for prosecution efforts. The professor's home became an armed fortress where federal agents maintained constant vigilance against assassination attempts. Perhaps most challenging was the protection of additional witnesses who emerged as the investigation expanded. Millworkers who had observed suspicious activities, local business owners who had noticed unusual chemical purchases, and government clerks who had processed falsified documents all required protection from corporate retaliation while their testimony was being prepared for court presentation. The Underground Railroad operation revealed the extent to which ordinary citizens were willing to risk their own safety to protect witnesses and preserve evidence of corporate crimes. Farmers provided hideouts, ministers offered sanctuary, and immigrant communities created protective networks that transcended ethnic and religious boundaries in service of justice. Morrison's reports to Washington described a situation approaching civil warfare, with federal agents and civilian allies fighting to protect witnesses and evidence against a corporate enemy that possessed virtually unlimited resources and demonstrated willingness to commit any crime necessary to avoid prosecution. The battle for justice had evolved into a desperate struggle for the survival of everyone who dared to challenge industrial tyranny. The expanding federal investigation triggered a sophisticated political counterattack orchestrated by the same network of corrupted officials whose crimes faced exposure in Morrison's prosecution efforts. Led by State Senator Jameson Crawford and supported by corporate lobbying efforts financed through Blackwood's network, the political campaign aimed to terminate federal jurisdiction through legislative action and judicial interference. Crawford introduced emergency legislation in the Michigan state legislature that would classify industrial safety matters as exclusively state jurisdiction, effectively preventing federal investigators from accessing evidence or interviewing witnesses related to workplace incidents. The proposed law represented a direct challenge to federal authority that constitutional scholars recognized as legally questionable, but Crawford's political influence ensured serious consideration from legislators who had received substantial corporate campaign contributions. Simultaneously, corrupted judges throughout Michigan's federal district courts began issuing rulings that restricted Morrison's investigative authority and challenged the admissibility of evidence collected from the Blackwood Mill. Judge Harrison Caldwell, whose financial connections to lumber industry interests had been carefully concealed, ruled that federal warrants used to search the mill's basement chambers had been improperly issued, potentially invalidating the physical evidence that formed the foundation of the prosecution case. The political counterattack extended to Washington, where Michigan's congressional delegation pressured Treasury Department officials to reassign Morrison and terminate the investigation on grounds that it exceeded federal authority and interfered with legitimate state commerce. Senator Richard Hawthorne, whose campaign finances included substantial contributions from Great Lakes lumber interests, demanded congressional hearings on federal overreach in industrial regulation. Corporate lobbyists flooded Washington with legal briefs arguing that the federal government lacked constitutional authority to investigate local industrial accidents, even when they involved interstate conspiracy and transportation of victims across state lines. These arguments, supported by expensive legal talent hired from prestigious Eastern law firms, created bureaucratic obstacles that slowed federal progress and provided time for corporate agents to eliminate remaining witnesses and evidence. Media campaigns throughout Michigan intensified their attacks on federal investigators, portraying Morrison's team as outside agitators who threatened legitimate business operations and state sovereignty. Newspaper editorials funded by corporate advertising money demanded that Michigan citizens resist federal interference in local affairs, creating public pressure that complicated witness protection efforts and jury selection for future trials. Most dangerously, the political counterattack included direct attempts to compromise Morrison's investigated ion through bribery and blackmail. Corporate agents approached federal officials with offers of substantial financial rewards for cooperation, while simultaneously gathering personal information that could be used to threaten investigators' families and careers. Morrison's reports to Treasury Department superiors described a coordinated assault on federal authority that represented an unprecedented challenge to constitutional governance. The investigation had evolved beyond a simple murder case to become a test of whether corporate power could effectively nullify federal law enforcement through political corruption and systematic intimidation. The outcome would determine not only justice for 5 missing workers, but the future balance of power between democratic institutions and industrial wealth in American society. Recognizing that corporate agents would spare no effort to destroy physical evidence before it could be presented in court, Federal Agent Morrison established a secure evidence vault in the federal building in Detroit, where the most crucial materials could be protected by armed guards and advanced security measures. The vault, constructed according to Treasury Department specifications for protecting sensitive financial documents, became the repository for evidence that would determine the success or failure of the entire prosecution effort. The centerpiece of the evidence collection was the coded ledger recovered from the Blackwood Mill's basement chambers, now subjected to comprehensive analysis by federal cryptographers who had experience decoding financial fraud schemes and interstate criminal communications. Their work revealed a systematic record of elimination operations spanning nearly 2 decades, with victim identifications, disposal methods, and payment records that documented hundreds of murders throughout the industrial Midwest. Chemical analysis of residues from the dissolution chambers provided forensic evidence that met the highest scientific standards available in 1891. Federal experts had identified specific compounds that could only have resulted from the systematic dissolution of human remains, while microscopic examination revealed bone fragments and organic material that confirmed the mill's use as a murder facility. Perhaps most valuable were the photographic materials that Hensley had revealed during his confession. Federal agents had successfully retrieved several collections of blackmail photographs from safety deposit boxes throughout Michigan, providing visual evidence of prominent political figures participating in elimination procedures and disposal activities. These photographs represented irrefutable proof of criminal complicity that could not be explained away or denied in court. Morrison's team had also assembled comprehensive financial records that traced the flow of money between corporate clients and the murder operation. Bank records, cancelled checks, and accounting ledgers revealed a sophisticated business enterprise that had generated millions of dollars in revenue through the systematic elimination of problematic individuals. The financial documentation provided evidence of interstate commerce that clearly established federal jurisdiction over the criminal conspiracy. Witness testimony, carefully recorded and corroborated, formed another crucial component of the evidence vault. Hensley's confession provided an insider's account of the operation's structure and methods, while survivor testimony from Lars Anderson, recorded before his assassination, offered a victim's perspective on the elimination process. Additional witnesses had been identified and interviewed, creating a comprehensive record of the conspiracy's scope and impact. The evidence vault also contained materials that revealed the political corruption network that had protected the murder operation. Campaign contribution records, correspondence between corporate executives and government officials, and documentation of bribes and payoffs demonstrated how democratic institutions had been systematically compromised to facilitate industrial violence. Federal prosecutors reviewing the evidence collection expressed confidence that the materials would support successful prosecution of the conspiracy's leadership, including corporate executives and corrupted government officials. However, they also acknowledged that presenting the evidence in court would require protecting witnesses and maintaining security against assassination attempts that could still derail the entire case. As summer arrived in 1891, federal prosecutors began the complex process of preparing their case for trial, knowing that they faced defendants who possessed unlimited financial resources and demonstrated willingness to commit murder to avoid conviction. The prosecution team, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney General William Foster, assembled in Detroit to coordinate what promised to be one of the most significant criminal trials in American history. Foster's strategy focused on presenting the evidence in a logical sequence that would allow jurors to understand the conspiracy's development and scope despite its complexity. The prosecution would begin with the specific case of the 5 missing Blackwood workers, using their disappearance to illustrate the elimination process, then expand to demonstrate the regional network of murder operations and political corruption that had protected the criminal enterprise. Jury selection presented unprecedented challenges, as the conspiracy's influence throughout Michigan made it difficult to identify citizens who had not been affected by corporate intimidation or political pressure. Federal marshals conducted extensive background investigations of potential jurors, seeking individuals whose economic independence and personal integrity would allow them to render verdicts based solely on evidence presented in court. The prosecution's witness list included over 40 individuals whose testimony would be required to establish the full scope of the conspiracy. Protecting these witnesses from assassination attempts required a security operation comparable to presidential protection, with federal agents providing round-the-clock surveillance and armed escorts for every individual who would testify against the defendants. Defense attorneys hired by the corporate defendants represented the most expensive legal talent available in American courts. Led by former Attorney General Augustus Whitman, the defense team included specialists in constitutional law, criminal procedure, and industrial regulation who challenged every aspect of federal jurisdiction and evidence collection. Their strategy aimed to portray the prosecution as federal overreach into legitimate business operations protected by state sovereignty. Media attention from throughout the nation focused on what newspapers called the trial of the century, with reporters from major cities arriving in Detroit to cover proceedings that would determine whether corporate wealth could purchase immunity from murder charges. The publicity complicated security arrangements while also providing protection for witnesses, as public attention made additional assassinations more difficult to conceal. Most challenging for prosecutors was the need to present evidence of dissolution chamber operations without sensationalizing the horrific details in ways that might prejudice jurors or create grounds for appeal. Foster's team worked with medical experts to develop testimony that would be scientifically accurate, but not so graphic as to overwhelm judicial proceedings with emotional responses that could undermine legal reasoning. The trial preparation revealed that the prosecution possessed evidence sufficient for conviction, but success would depend on their ability to protect witnesses, overcome political interference, and present complex technical evidence in ways that ordinary citizens could understand and evaluate. The stakes extended far beyond justice for 5 missing workers to encompass the fundamental question of whether American democracy could control corporate violence through legal institutions. As the trial date approached, the defendants and their corporate allies launched increasingly desperate attempts to prevent the case from reaching court, employing tactics that ranged from legal maneuvering to outright terrorism against potential witnesses and court officials. The campaign revealed the true extent of their power and the depths to which they would sink to avoid facing justice for their crimes. Cornelius Blackwood liquidated substantial portions of his business empire to finance the defense effort, selling lumber mills and timber holdings throughout the Great Lakes region to raise the millions of dollars required for legal fees, bribery attempts, and assassination contracts. His willingness to sacrifice his life's work demonstrated his recognition that conviction would result in execution, making any financial cost acceptable if it prevented the case from proceeding to verdict. The mysterious Mr. Harrison, whose role in coordinating the elimination operations had made him perhaps the most dangerous defendant, disappeared entirely from public view as federal marshals attempted to serve arrest warrants. Intelligence reports suggested that he had fled to Canada, where extradition treaties might not apply to his particular crimes, but federal agent Morrison suspected that Harrison remained in the United States, directing sabotage operations from concealment. State Senator Jameson Crawford and other political defendants attempted to claim legislative immunity from prosecution, arguing that their actions had been taken in their official capacity as elected representatives rather than as participants in criminal conspiracy. Their legal arguments, while constitutionally questionable, created procedural delays that provided additional time for witness elimination and evidence destruction. The defendants' desperation manifested most clearly in escalating violence against individuals associated with the prosecution effort. Federal Judge Samuel Morrison, no relation to Agent Morrison, received death threats that included detailed descriptions of how his family members would be killed if he failed to dismiss the charges. The threats proved credible when Morrison's home was bombed, though the family escaped unharmed due to federal protection measures. Court reporters and stenographers assigned to document the trial proceedings faced intimidation campaigns designed to create transcription errors that could provide grounds for appeal. Several clerks resigned their positions after receiving threats, while others required federal protection to continue their duties safely. Perhaps most troubling was evidence that the defendants had infiltrated federal law enforcement agencies, with corrupted agents providing intelligence about witness locations and security arrangements. Morrison's investigation revealed that at least 3 federal marshals had been compromised through bribery, creating security breaches that endangered witness protection operations. The defendants' increasingly frantic actions convinced federal prosecutors that conviction was not only possible but inevitable, provided that witnesses could be kept alive long enough to testify and evidence could be protected from destruction. However, the escalating violence also demonstrated that the corporate conspiracy would literally fight to the death rather than accept legal accountability for their crimes. The approaching trial represented not just a legal proceeding, but a battle between democratic institutions and industrial tyranny that would determine the future of American justice. On September 14, 1891, the trial of Cornelius Blackwood and 17 co-defendants began in the federal courthouse in Detroit, with security measures unprecedented in American legal history. Federal marshals had transformed the courthouse into an armed fortress, with sharpshooters positioned on surrounding buildings and metal detectors screening every person entering the facility. The proceedings would test whether democratic institutions could function under the threat of systematic violence from corporate defendants. Assistant U.S. Attorney General William Foster opened the prosecution's case with a statement that captivated the packed courtroom and newspaper reporters from across the nation. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, "the evidence will show that the defendants operated a murder enterprise disguised as legitimate business, systematically eliminating American workers whose only crime was seeking fair wages and safe working conditions." Foster's opening presentation methodically outlined the prosecution's evidence, beginning with the disappearance of the 5 Blackwood mill workers and expanding to demonstrate the regional network of elimination facilities and political corruption that had protected the criminal conspiracy. His description of the dissolution chambers and chemical disposal methods left several jurors visibly shaken, while spectators in the gallery sat in stunned silence as the scope of the murders became clear. The defense team, led by Augustus Whitman, countered with arguments that portrayed the defendants as legitimate businessmen who had been victimized by federal overreach and sensationalized accusations. Whitman claimed that the evidence had been fabricated by disgruntled former employees and ambitious federal prosecutors seeking career advancement through sensational cases that captured public attention. The first prosecution witness was Sheriff Edmund Hayes, whose testimony established the timeline of the initial investigation and the systematic obstruction that had prevented local law enforcement from solving the case. Hayes's account of corporate intimidation and evidence destruction provided jurors with crucial context for understanding why federal intervention had been necessary. Margaret Kellerman's testimony proved to be the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's opening case. Her dignified account of her husband's disappearance and the subsequent campaign to deny his existence brought tears to many eyes in the courtroom, while her presentation of personal evidence, letters, photographs, and family documents provided irrefutable proof of Thomas Kellerman's reality, despite corporate claims to the contrary. The prosecution's most dramatic moment came when Arthur Hensley took the witness stand to provide his insider's account of the murder operations. Under federal protection, Hensley described the elimination process in clinical detail, explaining how the mill's basement chambers had been used to dispose of victims whose only crime was threatening corporate profits through their knowledge of safety violations or labor organizing activities. Defense attorneys subjected Hensley to brutal cross-examination, attempting to portray him as an unreliable witness whose testimony had been purchased through federal immunity agreements. However, Hensley's detailed knowledge of the operation and his ability to corroborate his account with physical evidence made his testimony compelling despite defense attacks on his credibility. After 6 weeks of testimony that horrified the nation and forever changed public understanding of corporate power in industrial America, the jury retired to deliberate the fate of Cornelius Blackwood and his co-defendants. Their verdict, delivered on October 28, 1891, would represent either the triumph of democratic justice or the final proof that we ourselves could purchase immunity from any crime, no matter how heinous. The jury's deliberations lasted 3 days, during which federal marshals maintained siege-level security around the courthouse as corporate agents made final desperate attempts to influence the outcome through bribery and intimidation. Several jurors reported receiving death threats during the deliberation period, while others were approached with offers of financial rewards that exceeded their lifetime earnings. When the jury finally returned to the courtroom, their faces reflected the weight of the decision they had been forced to make. Foreman Patrick McNulty, an Irish immigrant who worked as a skilled machinist, stood to deliver verdicts that would reverberate throughout American society for decades to come. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, McNulty announced, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "We find the defendant, Cornelius Blackwood, guilty." The verdict on the primary charge was followed by guilty findings on 17 additional counts of murder, interstate conspiracy, political corruption, and obstruction of justice. Similar verdicts were rendered against all defendants who had been successfully brought to trial, with sentences ranging from life imprisonment to execution for those most directly involved in the murder operations. However, the victory came at a terrible price that illustrated the true cost of challenging corporate power in Gilded Age America. During the trial proceedings, 11 prosecution witnesses had died under suspicious circumstances despite federal protection, while others had been permanently disabled by assassination attempts. The resistance network that had fought for justice was decimated, with survivors scattered across the continent in permanent hiding. Margaret Kellerman, whose courage had provided crucial evidence for conviction, suffered a mental breakdown during the trial and spent her remaining years in a private sanitarium, financially supported by a secret federal fund established to care for victims of corporate retaliation. Her children were raised by relatives under assumed names, never able to publicly honor their father's memory for fear of renewed corporate vengeance. Sheriff Hayes resigned his position immediately after testifying, recognizing that his cooperation with federal investigators had made him a permanent target for corporate revenge. He spent his final years operating a small farm in Oregon, where he lived under federal protection until his death in 1923. The verdicts represented a momentous victory for democratic justice, proving that American courts could hold even the most powerful corporate interests accountable for their crimes. Yet the human cost of that victory demonstrated why such challenges to corporate power remained rare, and why the struggle for industrial justice would require generations of continued effort. More than a century after 5 millworkers vanished into the chemical dissolution chambers of the Blackwood lumber mill, the legacy of their sacrifice continues to echo through American labor history, serving as a testament to the price of challenging corporate power and the courage required to seek justice against seemingly insurmountable odds. The convictions secured by Federal Agent Morrison and Assistant U.S. Attorney General Foster marked a turning point in federal law enforcement's approach to corporate crime, establishing precedents for interstate conspiracy prosecutions that would be used against industrial violence for decades to come. The Treasury Department's success in the Blackwood case led to the creation of specialized units dedicated to investigating corporate terrorism and political corruption in industrial settings. Yet the victory's limitations were as significant as its achievements. While the primary defendants faced execution or life imprisonment, the broader network of corporate interests that had financed and protected the murder operations largely escaped prosecution. Many of the corrupted political officials simply relocated to different states, where they continued their careers with new corporate sponsors who valued their experience in suppressing labor organization. The dissolution chambers were sealed and the Blackwood Mill demolished within months of the trial's conclusion, but similar facilities continued operating throughout the industrial Midwest under different corporate names and improved security measures. The methods pioneered at Blackwood, systematic elimination of problematic workers, chemical disposal of remains, and political protection through bribery and blackmail, became standard practices for industrial interests facing organized labor challenges. Perhaps most tragically, the systematic erasure of the 5 workers' identities proved partially successful despite the prosecution's victory. While Thomas Kellerman, the Schmidt brothers, Patrick O'Malley, and Jonas Eriksson were vindicated in federal court, their names remained absent from most official historical records. Local historians continued to face pressure to omit references to the case, while newspapers avoided covering anniversary commemorations for fear of corporate retaliation. The families of the missing workers never truly recovered from their ordeal. The surviving widows and children lived under assumed names for the remainder of their lives, unable to publicly honor their murdered relatives or visit the unmarked graves where the dissolution chamber victims had been secretly interred. Their descendants, scattered throughout North America, carry the hidden knowledge of their ancestors' heroism and martyrdom, unable to claim their rightful place in labor history. Modern labor historians recognize the Blackwood case as a watershed moment in the struggle between workers and corporate power, illustrating both the potential for justice and the terrible price of challenging industrial tyranny. The 5 millworkers who vanished on March 15, 1891 became symbols of countless unnamed heroes who sacrificed their lives for the principle that American workers deserved safety, dignity, and the right to organize without facing murder for their convictions. Their blood still calls for justice from the dissolved ruins of the Blackwood Mill, reminding us that some victories require generations to complete and that the price of industrial democracy must be paid again and again by those brave enough to challenge power in defense of human dignity. Tell me in the comments, do you believe corporate power today still operates with the same ruthless methods, just more sophisticated? What would you have done if you discovered evidence of such systematic murder in your own community?